when we think about interference in elections, where that happens is social media. It's not bugs in the voting machines. It's things that bad actors putting out false information on social media platforms is largely where we see that kind of stuff.
Okay, so let's move into general voting information. So this may seem like a no-brainer for someone who is already familiar with voting. But if this is your first time voting, or perhaps it's been a while and you plan on voting in the upcoming election, you might find this information particularly helpful. Who can vote in the United States?
So United States citizens can vote. If you are, here on a green card or you're not a United States citizen, you can't vote except in maybe some local elections. Some immigrant folks can vote in like city council and smaller elections, but the general election is for citizens only. One misconception that I'm really trying to make people aware of is I think a lot of folks think that if you have some kind of criminal record, that you will be barred from voting for life or something. But if you have a misdemeanor, if you are in jail with a misdemeanor, you can probably vote. If you are a convicted felon, you can vote if you've served your time. Once you have served that time for your felony, you likely still have access to your right to vote, and that's really important to me. I think that formerly incarcerated people face so many barriers in accessing so many things, and democracy is something that I really hope people can see is continues to be a right regardless of what happened in your past in that respect.
So, how can we check our voter registration status and information to ensure that we are able to cast our vote in November?
There's wonderful platforms out there. I like to use vote.gov. If you go to my little funnel, hot2vote.com, enter your info. As soon as you've entered that, it'll dump you right over to vote.gov. You can check your registration. You can register online if your state allows that. Not every state does. And I do want to say that especially if it's been a while, and even if it hasn't, check your voter registration. It takes like 1 or 2 minutes. And I have heard stories about certain states like dumping voter rolls, and so maybe you have to re-register. It's just always good to check before election day, and some states allow you to register almost up until the actual election, but don't rely on that. Register as early as you can and vote as early as you can. So many states allow for early voting, and I know a lot of folks have like test taking anxiety, and going into the polls can totally trigger that. I'm just like, oh my God, it's 1998. We're taking the state exam. Our school's not going to get funding if I don't pass. So, if you can definitely register as an absentee or get a mail in ballot. What I like to do is to get my mail in ballot, take like 1 or 2 days to fill it out. I usually have a little dinner party with my girlfriends. Los Angeles has lots of jurisdictions, so we all come together, and we're not usually voting for the same thing. It's just like, wait, who are your judges? Let me. I don't have those judges. Oh my God, let's Google him. And turn it into a fun community project. It doesn't have to be a stressful scantron that you're filling out in a dark booth on election day. Set yourself up for success. Get your ballot, and even if it's not your actual ballot, sometimes they will send you a sample ballot so you can like have your answers with you when you go in. But I like to get an absentee ballot, a mail-in ballot, fill it out with my friends, take my time researching each candidate, researching each proposition, and then on or before election day, take it to either a specific mail ballot drop box, of which we have all sorts of them, at least where I live in LA, or take it to a polling place and hand it off yourself. So yeah.
All right. Are there typically voter registration deadlines then?
Yes, yes, yes. They vary state to state. I really wish that there was something a little bit more consistent, but It really does vary, and they are starting to come up. Sometimes it's 14 days before the election, and like I said, in a few states you can register almost up until election day.
Okay.
Even be given like a provisional ballot. Although be careful with provisional ballots; those can sometimes not get counted. It's better to make sure you are registered and have your ballot on the day of or before election day.
Okay. And I know this is a repetitive question, but just for good measure, I'll ask it anyways.
Mhm.
So, how do we vote? What methods specifically are available to vote? And also, is one method better than another?
Ooh, great question. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say yes. I think voting early is better. It's just you avoid the lines, you avoid the stress. If you're mailing in your ballot, it gives it some time to get there. Um, so I really love an early voting whenever you can. However, voting is voting, and if you do it, it's good. So don't get mired about like one way being better than another. It's just all about, I mean, I hate to say it, but it's all about making sure that you can avoid pitfalls of voter suppression tactics because they exist. They're everywhere. They're going to be out in full force this election. So, for example, a voter suppression tactic happens at the polls, like bureaucracy around your ballot versus this ballot. So if you can just avoid that altogether and vote early, send it in like a week before, done. Love it.
It is probably the earliest that you've seen that people are permitted to
I
vote.
feel like second or even first week of October is some of the earliest voting
Oh, that's
deadlines.
pretty early.
It's
Okay.
very early. Like early voting is about to kick off in the next couple weeks. So
Yeah. Okay.
take advantage, get in there.
What about for those people that are super last minute, kind of like me, and we tend to be last minute about things sometimes because, life and, things get busy. So, what about for those people?
So a couple things. I still really recommend that you get your ballot ahead of time, like register as either an absentee or get a mail-in ballot somehow so you can kind of work on it. You doesn't have to be, and you can turn it in at the very last minute, but it can be something, and maybe even that's not a provisional ballot, a practice ballot. If it's not your actual ballot, you don't want to be carrying that in your purse for a week leading up to it, but have it with you, when you have little breaks here and there and be like, okay, so what is this judge's deal? And take 3 minutes, do a quick Google of one of a candidate or a proposition, and then make a little note of it. Call a friend. So see it as a project that you're gonna piece together piece by piece. So on election day, it's getting late. You're a busy person. You've got a million things going on. Oh my God, it's November 5th. I have to go vote before the polls close.
Yeah.
Hopefully, you'll have a practice or a mail in ballot with you. You can just drive to the polls to drop it off or get in line to fill out your actual ballot in the polling station with your very special practice ballot, the answers to your test. So you don't have to think about it at all once you're in there. You just fill out what you filled out earlier. Now, about being in line. Now, I think that this election in particular, because I believe so, 2 days ago was National Voter Registration Day. And I read, I think, on vote.org that it was the largest in history. We registered like
Oh,
just millions of people. It was a big turnout. And so I think we will see a lot of first time voters this year. And so the lines may be long. So
okay.
getting there early is important. But also, if you get there and you're in line when the polls close, do not get out of line. You still have a right to vote if you are in line when the polls close. Don't rely on that, but also know
Right.
that that is your right. Um, I should have it. Listen, go to hottovote.com. I will be releasing a communication about those day of voting rights, who to call if you are in a situation where you're in line and they're trying to close the polls before you vote. I know that there's like an emergency voting, situation that you can call for resources to help make that happen.
Okay.
Don't get out of line if the polls close while you're still in line. Very important.
So the November 5th election is not limited to just the presidential race, even though that's really, I feel like, the majority of what we hear about. So, what else can we expect to be casting our votes for on November 5th? And what should people expect to see on their ballots? I know this can vary, but yeah, in general.
So much. I really want to honor anybody who is feeling burnt out and having voter fatigue, specifically about the general election and the presidential election. It is deeply important, but there are a million other pieces that are deeply important. Every election, and this election in particular. So, of course, we're looking at Congress, right? The House and the Senate both operate on incredibly narrow margins of majority, right? And so, either of those houses could flip in this election in terms of who has the majority for power. So, it's deeply important that you research which congressional seats are up for reelection and who is running, and engage in those races, because that is how things get done. The president can always issue an executive order, and especially now with the most recent Supreme Court decisions about presidential power, obviously the executive office holds a ton of power. However, the whole idea, if you remember, one thing they did teach me in my high school civics course, as well as, School of Rock, is that Schoolhouse Rock? Schoolhouse Rock taught us. And the president can only do so much. Bills can only get passed when both houses of Congress move them through. So it's
Mhm.
really important. And that is also true not just at the federal level, but at each state level. So there are all sorts of pieces of legislation that affect us state to state, and we have representatives that go to our state's Congress and enact those laws, and the same rules apply there. So it's deeply important that you vote in both your state and your federal elections for the people that represent you, because those are the folks, their offices are certainly just a couple miles from probably where you live. So this
Mhm.
is the person that you're going to be engaging with for their entire term, hopefully, right? So I think one of the reasons why we see presidential candidates choose the vice presidential candidates that they chose, I think we've heard Kamala Harris say this about Tim Walz, is like, that's who she wants to work with for the next 4 years. And the same is true for your congressional and state representatives. You're going to pick who you're going to work with for the next, however long their term is, who you're going to go during office hours and knock on their door and leave a little pamphlet and say, Jim, why'd you vote that way, my guy? We talked about this last week. I sent 3 faxes. Um, because it's not just about voting, right? Voting is just the kickoff of the game, right? Once we have those people in office, we need to be engaging with them as constituents, because we are their boss. Our taxes pay their wages, so they work for us. And never forget that. Just like an agent in the adult industry, they work for you. You don't work for them. So that's very important to consider and remember. Then, of course, there's the propositions, and there's lots of laws that come on the books that will deal with county infrastructure, roads, of course, healthcare, abortion. A lot of those pieces are on the ballot, this election in different states. A lot of states that have enacted abortion bans are now trying to codify the right to an abortion at the state level in the fall of since Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court. So that's super important to educate yourself on. And it's very, ballot initiatives can be weird too. They can be worded in a way that makes you vote the wrong way than
Yeah.
you wanted to, right? So
Yeah.
do your research and really make sure you are voting the way that you want to vote, because it can get complicated sometimes. The wording is crazy. And then, of course, there's like the nonpartisan positions that are going to be on the ballot. So some places you may be electing a new district attorney or a city attorney. And may I remind everyone that city attorneys are the folks who prosecute misdemeanors. What is a misdemeanor? Prostitution is a misdemeanor. So your city attorney decides which sex workers go to jail and which don't. That's
Yeah.
pretty important. So figuring out and that's not a simple like, oh, which party is he? That's not how that works. You have to look at someone's
Yeah.
record. You have to look at someone's principles and how they move through the world, who supports them. I know it sounds like a lot. I don't want to overwhelm anybody. I'm a nerd about this stuff.
No, I
But
love the passion though behind it. I do.
yeah, so there's all of these pieces, and then of course judges, right? In addition to district attorneys and city attorneys, doing your research on the judges is so important. We're always choosing judges on each election, and I think a lot of people phone that part in. They're like, who is this person? They don't have an endorsement from the party that I usually work with, so I'll just put anybody. But judges again decide who goes into a cage and who doesn't. It's huge.
Mhm.
It's huge.
How can people make informed decisions about who they vote for? I mean, you mentioned doing a bit of research, but are there any resources that you like to use also to research your candidates and
Absolutely.
decisions?
I love a voter guide. I'm actually trying to put together my own voter guide around Project 2025 because as far as I could find, one doesn't really exist yet. There's a lot of information, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's not a concise voting guide that talks about which candidates may or may not support these different types of principles and policies.
Mhm.
So it's very individualized. The voter guide that I use is not going to be the voter guide that will work for someone else based on their differing values or just legitimately where they live. I and this happens to me all the time. Like I've used Ground Game LA or Knock LA's like progressive voter guide. But a lot,
Okay.
I live out in the East Valley, so a lot of my candidates like aren't even on there, and so it's very individualized, county by county, state by state. But if you Google, the League of Women Voters does a great nonpartisan voting guide. The ACLU does a voting guide, and so if you find an organization that matches up with your own principles, so you can outsource that down ballot research just a little bit because there are organizations that are doing this voting guide work. Usually editorial boards like the Los Angeles Times will produce some type of voting guide, and that'll differ state to state as well. But there are resources out there.
Yeah.
It's not all on you. You just don't have to be at your computer at night googling until you fall asleep. You can find a cheat sheet, and they're everywhere. But find whether it's like a publication or an organization, a nonprofit, or a community group. There's stuff out there for you. You can find it. And always, again, feel free to hit me up. There's also the piece usually on Ballotpedia. You can see
Oh, yeah.
candidates, for example, or propositions and pieces of legislation. You can see who supports them underneath. Usually in the voter guide that they'll send you in the mail, or like I said, you can go to Ballotpedia. But seeing who endorses these candidates will also kind of help guide you.
So many Americans gather information through what's available on their social media feeds. I know my Gen Z children use TikTok for everything, and TikTok is fact to them. But are there any pitfalls to relying solely on social media for information when it comes to the election?
Oh my goodness, yes. Oh my goodness, yes. First of all, I think it's very important. I was deep into like the Mueller report and all of the litigation and investigations around the 2016 election and Russian interference in such. And the when we think about interference in elections, where that happens is social media. It's not bugs in the voting machines. It's you know things that bad actors putting out false information on social media platforms is largely where we see that kind of stuff. So you have to be very careful and also understand, even if there's not like a bad actor trickling down, everyone's played telephone, right? Where you like whisper in someone's ear and the word that came in through at the top of the group is not the word or the phrase that makes it to the end. It turns into this like Frankenstein monster. And I think we see that on social media for sure. Uh,
Yeah.
and also the way the algorithms are set up, they're not set up to educate or challenge you. They are set up to feed you more of what you like. And so if you like a piece of content that has bad information in it and you engage with that bad information, the algorithm will serve you up more of that type of content, and then you're just in an echo chamber. You're not actually doing research, you're not actually learning anything, you're just going in circles, and that doesn't help anyone. So listen to
Yeah.
public radio, listen to independent radio, read publications, talk to people who are impacted by things more than anything. If there's like a piece of legislation around the houseless community, talk to people who that's going to affect, see what they want. That's really get in there. We can't trust social media as much as I love it and as much as it really helped, and it's a great way to like organize and reach out to people. And I'm always encouraging adult industry folks to like use their platforms on social media for change, but it does have its pitfalls.
What is the difference between policies and principles, and what considerations should be made for each when deciding on a candidate?
Mm. Yes, well, I think this is a way to move through life as well. Like, don't tell me, show me.
Mm, mhm.
Policies, not platitudes. And principles are fine and dandy, but if the actions that candidates or leaders take do not fall in line with those principles, then they're for wash. It doesn't matter. There
Yeah.
are certain candidates who will say, and I think this is something I see in our community, because I mean, we all know that politicians lie. We all know that people who are in positions of power will misuse that power. And
Mhm,
I think that when people show you who they are, believe them. Believe them. You know?
mhm.
So really looking at people's track records regardless of what they say, I think is really really important.
Yeah.
um, it's important to find someone, to that falls in line with your principles and your values, etc., but more important than that is seeing what they actually do when
Yeah.
they have that power, and how they're able to actually move and enact change, and what those outcomes are for the communities that they affect, right? There's a lot of history, right, in candidates, and not everybody comes with like a long political track record, but we live in a world where social media footprints are real. And I think a lot of politicians actually today are learning that lesson. And so, you know, keeping your eyes open, and again, believing people when they show you who they are is really important. And like, don't I never trust what people say to me until I see the action, whether they're a politician or not. I want to don't tell me this, whether you're my husband or you're the presidential candidate. Don't tell me, show me.
Come correct.
Come correct or don't come at all.
So you had mentioned election fatigue, and many of us may be feeling that, especially with all of the events over the past few months. So, why is it critical for citizens to exercise their right to vote in November, regardless of kind of how we're feeling at this time?
So a podcast that I listen to, or I really enjoy, is called "If You Can Keep It," and it comes from that Ben Franklin quote of, well, sir, he comes out of the Constitutional Convention, and legend has it, someone asked, well, what do we have, sir? Do we have a republic or a monarchy? And the foundation of America. And Ben Franklin said, a republic, if you can keep it. Gives me chills every time I say it. I feel like such a dork.
I
Truly,
love it.
I love it. And yeah, it is ours to keep. This is the greatest democracy in the world. I know and that, there's a lot of critiques we can all have of this democracy, but it is here, it is ours. And unless we keep it, we will lose it. We will lose it. Look at Venezuela. One of my dear friends is from Venezuela, and what has happened there with their leadership becoming a dictatorship, and their elections turning into something that is violent. And uh, I don't want to see that happen here. And I feel like this election, if we allow people to take power who do not want to see democracy thrive, that it could die. It could absolutely die. And it's not hyperbole. It's not I'm not sounding an alarm to try to shock anyone. It's literally happening in a neighboring country where people we love have had to flee because the democratic process has fallen apart, and now it's in chaos. And now we have someone who is, not invested in a true democracy, but wanting to keep power. And I just don't want to see that happen here. I do love the United States. I am from here. I come from immigrants, of course, but a large part of my family is Native. And this is our land and our country. And I have no interest in seeing the American empire destroy it once and for all. Um, a lot of critiques of the American empire as well as a Native person. But I, I can't see the type of collapse that I feel like is imminent if we don't participate and vote as if our democracy and our livelihood and our freedoms depend on it, because they absolutely do. Absolutely do.
And I think for maybe some people that aren't as engaged in this space, or they really haven't been paying attention to really what's been happening, those types of statements can seem very far-fetched and alarming.
one core value of the United States is like the separation of church and state, right? The freedom of expression, separation of church and state. And
Yeah.
there are lots of folks who are not as down for that, you know, who really think, um, I grew up skipping the part of the Pledge of Allegiance where we say God. That's what was taught to me by my parents, because
Okay.
this is a democracy, and my uncle, he fled Iran in the late 70s because Iran was facing a massive shift towards a religious state, and that is the world that Iran is in now. And I don't want to invoke any type of like Islamophobia or anything like that, but the fact of the matter is, I have a dear relative who fled his home country because it became untenable politically. That
Okay.
is not far-fetched. It's literally one of my peers is from Venezuela and had to leave because it became untenable politically. Their democracy started to crumble and she had to leave her home.
Mhm.
My uncle, the same situation a generation earlier. So it's not far-fetched at all. And I have such um, an attachment to this land. When I think about, some leftists or folks will say, well, if the election doesn't go a certain way, I'm moving to Amsterdam or I'm moving to Canada or no, 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 no. And the thought of having to take my mother away from like our land that we fought the American government, in the name of, um, it just doesn't seem like something I can barely imagine it. And I know that it's something that I would do if necessary, for the safety of my family. But it's absolutely heartbreaking to think that we would have to abandon ship if democracy really began to crumble in the ways that we've seen it happen in other countries. So I'm deeply afraid of that. That's why I talk about voting so much. It is an imperfect solution, but it's the one that we have for now. And it's not the only thing. I think that that's something that people who critique democracy like to point out. And it's true. It's not just show up every 4 years and vote for your favorite team. That's not what democracy is. It
Yeah.
is civic engagement and involvement. It's transparency and accountability and work and organizing all year round, which I know is not for everybody, but it's important that everyone does what they can.